with me. Okay, has that come through?
Yeah, good.
Okay, so we're gonna basically have a look at what grows well in the Dyfi Valley and how we can adapt to our specific conditions. I'm going to be going in quite broad strokes because there is going to, even though we're all in Wales or maybe in the Dyfi Valley, there's still going to be a lot of differences in the kind of circumstances that we face. And mainly that is due to the soil and to the microclimates. So gardens, small gardens, especially in villages, very often are microclimates. And it depends on your elevation, for instance, how high up the mountain you are, also whether you're near to the coast, and also where on the landscape you are positioned. If you're at the top of a hill or the bottom of a hill, there can also be a lot of thermal mass in trees or hedges. So whether you've got those, but then a hedge at the bottom of a hill can mean that a lot of frost gets trapped in your garden. So it's different for all of us. One other big point is the aspect. So whether you're south facing or north facing, or there's poor people here who are east facing, it all has an impact on what will grow in your garden and how well it will grow. Then hopefully some of you will have some indoor space. Maybe you have a veranda, a greenhouse, or even a small polytunnel. And that will actually help you to grow a much wider variety of crops for much more of the year. So when we went undercover, as it says, you know, when we got polytunnels, it really changed the way we grew veg, because so much more became possible, and we've never looked back really. And if you're wondering about putting up a polytunnel, I know some of you are, and you're thinking about how big shall I make my polytunnel, one thing I can tell you, it's never going to be big enough. So always try and go for as big as you can. So the next thing really we need to look at as well is climate change. Climate change isn't just going to make us have a nice warm Mediterranean climate. It's actually going to cause more extremes of more extreme weather. So droughts and heat waves will be fiercer and last longer, and the same with floods. They will be heavier floods and they will last for longer. The same with all kind of weather patterns, they have a tendency now to get slightly more stuck. So this is also the reason why we tend to get more storms now in the summer, which is a real problem in the garden, because if your runner beans are nicely in leaf, they catch a lot of wind. So you've got to make sure that they are well anchored down. So apart from the unseasonal weather, unstable seasons, we also have more cloud cover. And more cloud cover means that actually less of certain wavelengths of light are penetrating that cloud cover. And that means it gives perfect conditions for mold growths. So a lot of fungal diseases can more easily take hold. So we're getting warmer and wetter winters and warmer and damper overall seasons. So how do we actually combat this? Well, the best way to start preparing ourselves for that is by actually making our soil in really good condition, making sure that we've got very, very resilient soil. And that means a lot of fiber, a lot of organic matter, but also no digging. Now, in some circumstances, you have to dig the first year, maybe the first 2 years. But if you put your spade down, and from the first spade of soil that you take out, and you find that there are a lot of earthworms and the soil is a good color and it's not compacted, then please don't dig. I wouldn't say go fully no dig the way Charles Dowding does, and use mulches with compost. So the big picture on here is Charles Dowding's garden. And as you can see, he's got all raised beds. And in the little picture in the corner, you see what we kind of understand more as raised beds, so with the wooden surrounds. Now, unless you have to have wooden surrounds because you're terracing on a hill, I would say try not to have wooden surrounds, because wooden surrounds need replacing, but they're also hiding places for slugs, for wood lice, and they all damage your plants. So Charles Dowding does his raised beds completely without sides, so they are more of a sloping kind, and they're not very rigid on the side. You can see, and the paths, he mulches his paths with compost just the same. At Enion's garden, we mulch our paths with wood chip, and that works really well as well, because wood chip benefits the fungal activity in the soil, the beneficial fungi in the soil, and so they do travel from underneath the paths into the bed. So what we found is that the some of the plants on the edges of the bed actually do better than the plants in the middle of the bed. And the reason for that is probably that fungal network that helps them get more nutrition and more moisture. So raised beds, um, they also avoid soil compaction. So you never walk on those beds. It means that the soil never gets compacted in there. You can access the soil earlier in the year and later in the year. It doesn't matter if you don't have to walk on the soil, you can work your garden all year round. It doesn't matter that you don't have to step out for a while if it's too wet, because you don't disturb the soil in which the plants are growing. And it's good for those people with bad backs, no digging. It means that you avoid a lot of work. So it's also faster. It means that when you clear the previous crop out, the soil is straight away ready to plant more crops. You put a mulch on once a year of about 2 to 3 centimeters maximum of compost. Don't over compost it. That's not so good for the plants either. But just enough to suppress the weeds. So again, it saves you work. Once you've got this good mulch on, you don't bring up any more weed seeds by digging, and it means that eventually the seed base for the weeds that are in the soil are sort of depleted, and weeding doesn't take 2 minutes because you just have less weeds. Now also the thing is with raised beds, not only are they better in wet soil, they're also better in dry soil because of the organic matter. They keep moisture much better, so you don't need to water so much. And of course, here in Wales, we've got a lot of hilly sides, we've got a lot of slopey gardens. Raised beds help you to terrace. So one side of the bed will be raised, the other one will be level with the side of the hill, of the slope that you are on. It also, on slopes, it helps a lot with drainage. And it's easy for crop rotation. If you've got your raised beds, it's quite tidy, it's nicely laid out. So I want to look a little bit more at the soil itself, because soil is actually very much alive. It's not an inert, dead thing that we just plant plants in and we feed the plants. In organic gardening, you always feed the soil. You don't so much feed the plants. You feed the soil organisms, because it's the organisms that actually convert the minerals and the fiber and the organic matter into food to your plant roots. So what do I mean with soil organisms? I mean mycorrhizal fungi, microbes, and other soil fauna. So there are these anthropods. They're quite amazing. They're the shredders, and you can see the nematodes. We know nematodes as bad guys, but actually there are a lot of good nematodes as well. But also worms, earthworms, they move a lot of material up and down in the soil. And when we first started Enion's garden, I remember not finding worms in the soil. The soil was that compacted and that dead that there were actually very few worms. And it wasn't until we've added a lot of organic matter, a lot of horse manure, that the worms started coming back. So not only are you going to get fewer weeds with no dig, the mulch also means that the color of your soil is darker, and therefore in spring, because your soil is darker, the soil also warms up quicker. So that might give you a week, 10 days difference that you can plant earlier than if your soil was paler in color. Some people put black plastic on their gardens, but you know, I hope in gardening we start to come away from the plastic use a little bit and start more using natural materials to cover our garden. So that garden life, that we call it also the soil food web, it is really important to have very lively soil, because it's actually that what helps you grow your plants. I heard somebody say that they didn't have a lot of success with the first growing season that they tried. It might be that the soil is a little on the inert side, that the soil needs to be brought to life. And I've not found anything better for bringing soil alive than good old honest horse manure. You do have to be aware a little bit of the fact that it can be contaminated with aminopyrrolate, but for that you can do a simple test. But if you get offered any manure, go and get a few handfuls, mix them with equal amounts of bought-in compost, and put them in 3 different pots. Plant a bean in each pot. Broad beans works really well. You plant 2 or 3 beans in each pot, and you see what happens. If they all grow normally and there is no distortion, then that means that manure is good to use. So I would also say, if you keep your soil healthy and not compacted, planting and sowing becomes a lot quicker, because you don't need to open the soil up, you don't need to loosen it, you don't need to do all that raking. You naturally have got the right tilth to sow in and to plant in. A lot of people also like the whole no-dig system, because the raised beds and the mulched paths give a very neat appearance. And if you have dogs, I saw somebody had a dog there, and I know some other people there who are here who also have dogs. Dogs also use gardens, but you can actually really train a dog to distinguish between the path and the vegetable bed, so that your dog can be in the garden with you without walking all over the vegetables. It will take a little bit of training, but they can learn, they can understand. Okay, I maybe want to see if there are any questions at this point. I'm not sure if I can see the chat from here, so if Helen could let me know if there are any questions.
Yeah, Alice has asked, do you put cardboard or weed membrane under the wood chip?
I don't, because we've got a very high slug population, and anything like that actually encourages slugs. Where I do put cardboard is around the fruit trees, and then I top that with manure. So that's the only place where I do put cardboard, because, you know, slugs can't harm fruit trees or fruit bushes.
Great, thanks, Anne. If anyone's got any other questions, maybe just put them in the chat, and then we can answer them sort of after each section, like Anne has done just then. Joe has asked, with the no dig method, what time of year would you add your layer of compost?
It's quite flexible, so you can add it if your soil is going to be bare over winter. If you're not going to have anything planted, then I would say add it in the autumn, so that your soil is protected and doesn't get compacted by lots of rain. So then it's a good time to put a good layer on. If you have crops growing in your soil, then don't worry, you can do it around now. This time of year is good, right up to March or May. So as you change, as you take one crop out, you can then also put the next load of mulch on before you plant your next plants. But the idea is really with no dig is that you never leave your soil unprotected. So if you know that beds are going to be empty over winter, then yes, either put a membrane on, like they're not quite plastic, they're a sort of plastic, but they're woven membranes and they last many, many years. I would recommend that. Or you put on a good layer of compost to protect it over winter, or a green manure. If you've got enough space, a green manure is always good. And around now, if you're growing a green manure, then around now or next month, it's time to then chop and drop it. As we say, you chop it off, you just leave it on the surface, and then you cover it again with a membrane to let it rot down into the soil.
Great, thanks. There are no more questions for now.
Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So light and airflow, that is an issue here that a lot of people don't take into account. And I heard a few people mentioning forest gardens. Now, the whole idea of a forest garden actually came from a very hot climate. It came from Australia. And in Australia, in order to grow certain crops, you do need to give them shade. And so it's very hard to replicate that in our climate, where we have so much overcast days, and even at the height of summer, the light hasn't got that same strength. So I would recommend, if you are doing forest gardens, is that you make your spacings a lot wider than is recommended by the Australian permaculturists, because it just will end up as a very soggy, damp area if you put everything as dense and as close as they do in Australia. Also, the other reason why you space things a little bit more here is because of the airflow. So because certain wavelengths of light encourage more mold growth, and those are the wavelengths of light that still come through the cloud, we do suffer a lot more from fungal disease here in Wales than we do in warmer places and drier places. So it is important that you get really good airflow going through your garden, and one way you can encourage that is by making your spacings a little bit wider, but also keep in mind that you don't build walls in your garden from plants. So keep that in mind when you decide where you are going to put your beans, for instance, your climbing beans, because they will act as a bit of a wall against any kind of airflow. Most people know what their gardens are like, whether there are drafts in their garden or whether it's very still, whether the prevailing wind comes in or whether it doesn't. So keep that in mind, where how the air flows through your garden, and put the plants accordingly. So don't try and block the airflow with taller plants with shorter plants behind them. And maybe if your hedge is getting a bit tall and you don't need it for wind protection, because that's the other side of the coin, of course, some people do need wind protection if you're close to the coast, then I would say trim that hedge a little bit and allow more of the air to naturally flow around in your garden. So if you're looking at a smaller scale, just on the actual raised beds, planting in rows can give better airflow than planting in the very popular diamond pattern. I know we're all trying to maximize our space, and diamond pattern planting has become very popular, especially as it also shades out any weeds. But the problem with that is that air doesn't flow as well. And for instance, with strawberries, I found that out myself, that strawberries work much better in rows, and you get a lot less botrytis, for instance, than if you have a close cover bed. So for those of us that are on a slope, it's worth noting that cold air always rolls down the hillside. So if your garden is at the bottom of a slope, you might end up with what's called a frost pocket, especially if at the bottom of your garden you then have a house wall or a hedge or a road blocking the cold air. and so that it keeps sitting in your garden. It's if it's a hedge, that's quite easy. You can make a gap in a hedge to allow the air to flow through. If it's a house, then that's a bit more difficult. You're just going to have to keep that in mind when you plant things. So another thing to help with the fungal growth is to water in the mornings. If you water your plants in the mornings, they have the whole day to dry off on, well, if it doesn't rain, but you wouldn't be watering if it was raining. So try and water in the mornings. It also means that the soil gets a little bit drier again before the evening when the slugs come out. Most people in Wales find that slugs are an issue. And when in gardens where airflow is restricted, I find that tall and climbing varieties of vegetables do better. And you might think maybe about finding ways of even training things like courgettes. You can train courgettes to climb up a frame, same as cucumbers, same as beans. So rather than having everything sitting down to the close to the ground. Let's see if I've covered all that. Yes, also when you are planting, when you are planning what you're going to plant in your garden, be aware where the sun goes in your garden, where it travels, from what side of your garden to the other side it travels, and where shade is cast. So again, if you plant taller plants in front of shorter plants, they might cast shadow during the day onto those smaller plants. So that's again something to keep in mind. I'll look at which veg and fruit, and then we'll stop again for a few more questions. So which veg and fruit work best? I think that's going to be very different for each gardener, because we all got certain affinities. Some of us are really good with growing sweet corn, for instance, and our neighbor can't get sweet corn to grow for love nor money. Gardening is funny like that. But I find with fruit, it's definitely better to go for the early varieties. Early varieties of soft fruit rather than the late varieties. The mid-season varieties seem to work generally quite well, but if you want to prolong the season a little bit, I would choose early varieties, because the later varieties, they mostly suffer from the climate here being too damp and too cool to be successful. Of course, there's going to be years where we're going to have a lovely Indian summer, and then they would do well, but most of the time you'll find that we actually have a very warm spring. And so if you have early varieties of fruit, they will fully benefit from those really warm springs that we get now. Now, if you're on higher elevations, that might be a bit different, because you might get late frosts. I remember Roger, at the gardener at Kent, always telling us about his June frost that got all his beans. So for those of us who are closer to the coast, that's usually not a worry. But if you're up in the hills, yes, then a late frost can get your tender fruits and your blossoms. So what you need is frost protection. In the shape of frost fleece that you can just throw over your flowering fruit, your bushes. You probably can't do that with your apple trees. I would imagine they would be too big to protect, but you definitely can put some layers of fleece on your strawberries, and even things like kiwis. If you have kiwi plants or other berry plants, you can just cover them with a layer of fleece or a couple of layers of fleece, and they should be all right. The same with their early potatoes. What we found is main crop potatoes, these in the last few years, they mostly got blight. So we've moved over to planting second earlies and treating them as main crop. Early potatoes are bred to mature earlier, so you have a little bit of a smaller crop. They are ready to be harvested sooner, and so they often miss the blight season, or by the time the blight arrives, there's enough potatoes there, and you can just cut the green stalks off and leave the potatoes in the ground to bulk up a little bit more, and then harvest. Again, if you're doing your earlies or second early, you plant them out sometime in March. It depends on what the weather will do. But have some fleece ready, because as soon as those potatoes start poking their leaves up through the ground, they become susceptible to frostbite. So you want to be able to throw some fleece over that so you protect them. On the other hand, you also need your hose pipe ready, because very often we get very warm and very dry springs, and once potatoes start bulking up, they do really like to have the soil kept moist. If you allow the soil to dry out and then you get a rainstorm, you end up with split potatoes, so you don't want that. Now, easy veg to grow here is leeks, of course. They grow without trouble, really. Lettuce and radishes, they're also really quite easy to grow. Herbs are fantastic here, but you do need to plant them on some gravel, or put them somewhere where there is a lot of drainage, because they really don't like the wet winters. And it's usually over winter that we lose all our Mediterranean herbs. Rosemary is the best advice I can give with rosemary, because they always sell beautiful big plants in the garden centres, and they very often aren't adapted for our climate. So rather than spending money on a big rosemary plant from the garden centre, see if one of your neighbours has got a good rosemary plant that has lasted several years, and try and take a few cuttings from that, because that will be a variety of rosemary that is well adapted to the local conditions. Now, veg that you might find difficult, I find those difficult as well, is, for instance, sweet corn. One of the reasons for that is because our climate is so damp. It's often very hard for the sweet corn's pollen to be dry enough to be dispersed through the wind, because it's wind pollinated. So if the pollen are always wet, they're not going to be picked up by the wind to pollinate each other. So again, try and find local adapted varieties. Real Seeds do a really good selection of local adapted varieties, and you might find that you're more successful with those than with the F1 super sweet varieties. Pumpkins is another thing. Again, I would say use adapted varieties, although the Crown Prince, which is a grey pumpkin, a blue-grey pumpkin, it's an F1, and that one is really good for this climate. And I think it's because its colour, it seems to absorb a lot more sunlight, and it seems to ripen really quickly, really early on. So that's a really good one to grow. French beans, yes, they're quite difficult, but the mistake that most people make around here is they sow them too early. You can get them going a little bit earlier if you can sow them inside and let them germinate inside, but please don't plant them out until the end of May, beginning of June, because the soil is just too wet and too cold, and they don't get going, and then they fall victim, because they're growing so slowly, they fall victim to slugs and to rabbits and to all sorts. So the later you leave it, the better it is. You'll get a slightly smaller crop, but you'll get a crop, and that's the difference. Again, with tomatoes, I'd say around here, best undercover, although some people have got microclimates in their gardens around their house. They might have somewhere where they've got a wall that gives them good thermal mass, and that contains the heat a little bit. But yeah, for tomatoes, if you find them difficult, go for those varieties that ripen very early. Again, the Real Seeds, honestly, I am not getting paid by Real Seeds Company to say this, but they have got open pollinated, locally adapted varieties. For instance, Galena tomato is very early, and it keeps fruiting all the way through the season. And they're a small yellow cherry tomato, and they're absolutely beautiful. And the other nice thing about Galena tomato is that it's what it's called a potato leaf variety, and they have less leaves, which means that the light gets through the fruit. So the smaller and less leaves, and they are potato, like they are shaped like a potato leaf, not like a classic tomato leaf. So that's a good one to look for. And there are other potato leaf varieties which are equally early. The tomatoes that are difficult around here are the big beef stick tomatoes, the plum tomatoes, because they are later in the season and they often catch blight if they're outdoors. Indoors, if you don't spray, when you water them, if you don't get the foliage wet, you'll probably avoid blight. Okay, so I can see that there are a few more questions. I can't see the actual questions, but if Helen will read them out to me, then I can answer them.
Yeah, great. Andy's got a question about the fleece, the winter protection you mentioned about a membrane. He says, is that the same as fleece?
No, the membrane is a woven black membrane. Some people call it Mypex. So I think it's the name of a make of that particular membrane.
Great. And Rosie asks, what are your favourite green manures for no dig and a place near the sea where temperatures don't get very low?
Oh, Phacelia. There's no doubt about it. Phacelia is amazing. You do have to sow it a little bit earlier than some of the others. So you probably need to sow it in August, but you can undersow veg that is still growing. And if you sow it early enough, you get wonderful blue flowers, blue purple flowers that the bees really love. And then we've got a few other ones which we don't actually sow anymore. They self-sow. And so one of them is Antes, which is poached egg flower, which is a great early flower which attracts loads of pollinators and beneficial insects. And also winter purslane. And that puts itself over the whole garden. We just allow that to self-seed, and we pick a fair bit of winter purslane to go into the salad bags. That's a really nice one as well.
Great, thanks, Anne. There's a couple more questions. Do you use soil blockers instead of plugs or pots? And do you use any peat-free compost? Do you have any trouble with them drying out?
Okay, so that is quite, yes, I do use soil blockers because especially lettuce for me is a very important crop. It's a big part of my income. And in the summer, because it's so dry nowadays, in for a part of the spring, we always end up with what they're called again, root aphids, and they really attack the roots of lettuces. And we find that if we grow the lettuces in soil blocks, the air pruning that you get from the roots in the soil block means that you get a very solid big root block before you plant them out. And so the lettuces are much more resilient to these root aphids. As a matter of fact, they get the root aphids, but they then die from them. You know, it seems that the plants are strong enough to cope with them. Now, to make the soil blocks with peat-free compost, and please, everybody, you know, we all should be using peat-free compost. It's really not acceptable anymore to still use peat in this day and age. My favorite mix is I use Melcord Silver Grow, which I sieve, and so that it's quite fine. And then I add my own compost, which again I sieve. So that's and the compost we make is quite claggy because we mainly make cold compost, and and that actually holds the soil blocks together. And then we also add some sharp sand, and that helps with the drainage. And we find that works really, really well. And you have to just sort of play about with the mix a little bit and see what works for you.
Thanks, Anne. There's one question about starting off beans, and I just wanted to flag up that we are going to have a session on the 15th of February about sowing early and sowing seeds and what to do with them. So come along to that and you'll learn all about when to put your beans out. Also to mention that Sabrina's written in the chat that there will be the plank, as there was last year, opposite the co-op, which is where you can leave and collect little seedlings for your garden, and that was really popular last year, so that will happen again this year when things get going.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're looking at adaptation techniques. So most of our adaptation techniques in Wales are aimed at extending the season so that you can start a couple of weeks earlier and keep going a couple of weeks longer. And one system that we use a lot is hotbeds, which are very high raised beds. They are with a wooden surround. They're actually 1 meter high, and we fill those with fresh, stable clearings from horses. And if you would be interested in that, the little picture that says hotbeds is actually the cover of a book by Jack First, and I would really recommend. It's a little book, it's not very expensive, and it's got such wonderful information in it about hotbeds, and also the history of hotbeds, which is really interesting, how they were used in France to grow all the veg for London during the winter in the olden days, in the Victorian days. So another way to deal with very soggy plots, and that we've used, is hugelkultur. So you've got a cut through in the left bottom corner of the slide here, which shows you what a hugelkultur bed looks like. So it's a very high raised bed, but what is special about that is that actually you can't see that on that picture, but you actually dig down for about, you make a bed in the soil about 1 foot down. You take all the soil out and you fill that space and the little bit on top with wood, and preferably rotten wood. You can use new wood, but you know, why would you use new wood? You can use new wood for other things, burning, for instance, but usually wood that is actually past its best for burning, that is already slightly rotten, is best to use in a hugel bed. And don't just use small branches, you know, use quite substantial logs. And then you put a layer of fresh manure over that. Here they've used leaves and grass, but you can use just fresh manure, and then you cover that over with the soil that you initially dug out. And then you have a bed that when you first start will be 2 feet, 2.5 feet high. Eventually they do flatten out somewhat because obviously the wood inside rots. But you end up with a bed that's got amazing drainage, but the wood acts as a sponge. So in dry summers, you don't have all the water that's run down to the bottom of the bed that your plants can't get. The water is still, actually, the moisture is still contained within the bed, within the structure of the wood, and the plant roots can still access it. You also get a very high level of fungal activity in that sort of beds, and plants really benefit from that. And every year we grow our courgettes on our hugel beds, and they absolutely love it. The nice thing with hugel beds is that you also end up, if you align them well, that one side of the hugel bed is the one that catches the sun and the other side gives you shade. It means that on the shady side you can grow a later crop of spinach that won't bolt so quickly. So that's another advantage that you have. So then, yes, you can see the polytunnel. I don't know of a single gardener who wouldn't want a polytunnel or a greenhouse. They are amazing places and they are usually well worth the investment. I would say with greenhouses, have a look on eBay. You know, there's a lot of greenhouses ready to be taken down. If you go and take them down and take them away, you can sometimes get them for free. So that's certainly how we got our greenhouse. And then at the bottom right hand corner is these low tunnels. And this year we're hoping to use that technique a lot more at Einion's garden, because it means that you can start your crops a little bit earlier. if it looks like you're going to get some bad weather or it's continuously wet and you want to give your crop some protection, it's very quick and easy to put fleece or plastic over those hoops and give your crops that little extra protection. Same at the other end of the season. If you have all your pumpkins and they're not quite ripe yet, you can just cover them over with one of those little low tunnels, and that will help them give those extra couple of weeks to ripen off properly. Now, another important thing that is not on this slide is locally adapted seed. So I know for a lot of beginner gardeners that sounds like really challenging to save your own seed, but the difference is amazing if you do. You find the second generation of seed of plants that you've grown from seed that you saved yourself will do better in your garden because it is adapted to the local conditions of your garden. And every year that you save those seeds, it will be more adapted and it will give you better results. Your plants will be stronger. They will probably flower earlier and they'll be more resilient to the diseases that might otherwise attack them. So a really easy one to start with is tomatoes, because most tomatoes are what's called inbreeders and they don't cross. And you just let one tomato on a nice plant. You take a nice tomato, you let that grow until it's really, really ripe. And then when it's almost rotten, then you pick it. And then there are techniques to save that seed. You have to ferment it, but it's quite easy. And then you have enough seed probably for a couple of years just from one tomato. The only thing you have to make sure is that you only save seed from open pollinated varieties. Again, you can find a lot of information about that on the website of the Real Seeds Catalogue. So go and have a look. And that's something else that, we have rather more of than an urban garden is here in rural gardens. We have got a lot of wildlife, and some of that is to our benefit and some isn't. So rodents can very quickly become a problem. Bank voles, they are the ones responsible for you going out and wanting to pick your beetroot, and you pull the leaves of the beetroot to find that actually it's only the leaves that are left there with a little crown, and the whole beet underneath has been eaten away, and your garden is completely tunneled by these guys, and they can consume a lot of your veg. So the way to make your garden a little bit less hospitable to these guys is by making sure that you keep it tidy, in the sense that you don't allow big amounts of stuff, of rubbish to accumulate. You don't use your garden as somewhere to store all your plant pots and your compost bags and what have you, because all of those spaces will be used by rats especially to make a home and to explore your garden from. Now, owls are your best friend in to keep the rodents in check. So can I please ask people not to put out poison for rats and for mice, because in the first place, there isn't a poison that you can buy over the counter that still does the job. By now, most of the rats and the mice are adapted, especially rats actually, are adapted to the poisons, and it doesn't kill them anymore. It makes them poorly and it makes them move more slowly, and therefore they are easier to catch by the raptors, such as owls and other birds of prey. One owl can catch up to 1,500 rodents a year. So if you have an owl that normally visits your garden, just imagine how many mice and rats and voles that bird will pick off. And they'll soon find when there is too many of the rodents in your garden. It takes maybe a year, maybe you're going to have problems for a year, but after a year, the predators will have found that food source and they will come and keep them in check. So that's a little bit on the rodents. So yes, please don't use poison, because all that happens is you poison the owls because they eat the poisoned rats and mice. Now also, you really want to attract pollinators. In the right hand corner you see a little hoverfly. They are those amazing, they look a little bit like tiny wasps, and they literally hover, and they come in different sizes, but that is a really classic one, that one there. They don't make a buzzing sound, so that's another way to recognize them. And then of course in the top left hand corner you have the honeybee. Now you'd need pollinators to spread the pollen about so that the plants set fruits. And one way of attracting the pollinators to your garden earlier is by planting early flowers. Again, it might take a couple of years before the pollinators know that there is a food source there for them, but eventually their number will increase in your garden. So if you make sure that you plant early flowers such as limnanthus, and through the summer flowers like borage and calendula, and allow your herbs to flower as well, because pollinators love flowering herbs, it will attract a lot of these guys into your garden. And also it will attract the other beneficial insects that predate on aphids, for instance. So wasps really like dill flowers and any kind of that flower of that shape. We found fennel, herb fennel. If you let that flower, it will often be covered by wasps, and when they're actually on fennel, they are quite sedate. They're not aggressive. It's something about the plant that really calms them down. Try and always have a brassica flowering on your plot. So if you've got Brussels sprouts or purple sprouting broccoli that you didn't get around to picking, or it wasn't quite good enough, allow it to flower, because brassica flowers are really, really good to attract predatory insects. So if you have aphids, make sure you've got flowering brassicas, and the wasps will come and they will take care of your aphids. Also the hoverflies, they will take care of your aphids. You can also grow nasturtiums under your cabbages and your purple sprouting broccoli. It will confuse the caterpillars, the cabbage whitefly, and you might be able to pick them off the nasturtium leaves before they attack your brassicas. And again, wasps love to eat baby caterpillars, so love your wasps. Okay, so I think we are just about there. So I'm going to say, really accept the feedback that your garden gives you. Be tolerant of your failures. They're only learning experiences, really. Celebrate the successes you have. And I love that quote by Alfred Austin, that there is no perfect gardening. There is no perfect gardener, because conditions always change. One year something works, the next year it doesn't. And sometimes you just don't know why that is. That's why if you plant a variety of things, you're always going to have something that works and something that doesn't. But that's gardening for you. So I can take a few more questions now.
Yeah, there's one question in the chat from Jean. She says she's trying to decide between a greenhouse and a polytunnel. Which is more useful?
If you can afford it, a greenhouse, because it holds the warmth better and it lasts longer. So with polytunnels, you do need to clean you need to clean glass, but it doesn't degrade. Glass stays for 20 years, it's fine. Whereas a polytunnel, after 10 years, you usually have to replace the plastic, if not sooner.
Thanks. Are there any more questions? You can write in the chat, or if you want to just unmute yourself, that's fine too. Anne, shall I'll just stop sharing, or have you got more slides?
Yeah, stop sharing and then I can see the chat.
You can turn your cameras on too if you want to.
Just gonna quickly check the.
Yeah, sure. I think I caught most of the questions.
Okay.
Does anyone have any other questions? Anything that's gone unanswered?
Well, somebody says it's hard to buy from Real Seeds at the moment. They usually open on a Saturday morning, last I knew. So you have to have an early Saturday morning. But this year, it's really remarkable how hard it's been, even after last year, how hard it still is to get seeds. Last year, it was really difficult to get seeds. And this year, we're there again. I don't know whether Brexit has got something to do with it, but there certainly is. There's not so much shortages as just the seed companies don't seem to be able to get them out quickly enough. So it's another really good reason to save your own seeds. And if I can just refer you to Katie Hastings, she's doing a lot of work with the Gaia Foundation on seed saving workshops. So you might keep an eye on what she's up to, because that's interesting stuff. And then somebody asked, if we're starting beans off indoors, how long should you keep them in before planting out? Well, if they're climbers, they will let you know when they need planting out, because they'll start getting tall and they start looking for a stick. So that's the time to get them out. If they are bush beans, then I would say plant them out when they're sort of 15 centimeters high and nicely resilient.
Also, if you're interested in seed saving, Edible Mac's doing a workshop in March. We've got the people from Vital Seeds coming to do a 1-hour workshop for us. And if you want to go into even more detail, they do a whole course that you can buy online, and just sort of self-learning course that you can do for that. And Katie's also put try Vital Seeds Seed Co-op for UK grown open pollinated seeds. And Seed Sovereignty is where you can get lots of info.
And there's a really good little book by Sue Stickland on back garden seed saving. That's a really nice book to get. It'll give you a lot of information. It makes it very simple.
Sarah.
Okay.
Talking of which, I'll put a link in the chat for the next few we've got coming up. So Monday night, we've got the next one, which is going to be planning your veg garden and thinking about crop rotation. And then the following Monday will be about early sowing, so what you can sow now for the spring. So do come along to those if you're free.
And for anybody who's interested in getting a set of soil blockers, it's Blackberry Lane that sells them. And they're a very good piece of equipment to share with a few of you. You don't all need to get your own seed blockers. If you're happy to share tools, seed blockers are probably a good thing to share.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. That was really brilliant. And so nice to see so many people on this. So feel free to unmute and say goodbye if you want to, and hopefully see you at the next one.
Thank you so much. Really useful.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank